Yo, what's up guys? Michael here from DMP Authority, and I hope you're having an amazing day. So, welcome to the first video of 3 in this brand new course covering the fundamentals of synthesis. Now, no doubt, if you're unfamiliar with synthesis, you will take one look at a synthesizer and see a complete mess of buttons, knobs, sliders that make no sense at all. Well, now we're going to get our hands dirty with the most important basics of synthesis. So by the end of this series, you'll know exactly how synthesizers work and how to craft your own unique sounds. So in this video, we're going to learn how to make swelling bass lines, firstly by understanding various waveforms, and secondly by learning how to use envelope tools. So without further ado, let's dive in. At a fundamental level, synthesis is the art of creating sounds using synthesizers, and they come in various shapes and sizes and are either physical hardware or digital software, which we'll be using in this course. The sound outputted by synthesizers allows us to imitate instruments and natural sounds, as well as generate new, unique electronic sounds. And we achieve this via a few different tools common to almost all synthesizers. So, at its highest level, we need to think of synthesis as the generation and then the modulation of sound. The idea is we generate a sound using an oscillator, and sometimes with more than one. These sounds on their own are actually pretty generic and boring, not to mention harsh. So, once a signal is generated, we then change and modify the signal by modulating it in a variety of interesting and creative ways using various tools. Now, every synthesizer has its own purpose and character. Some can be very generic, whilst others can be entirely unique. But at the end of the day, most common synthesizers pack a very similar set of tools. So, sound is created by moving or oscillating a signal back and forth incredibly quickly. These oscillating signals create waveforms, and we can make different types of waveforms resulting in different sounds. The most important feature of an oscillating waveform is its shape, because the shape of the oscillation determines the kind of sound we hear, and we can use them to create the different sounds and different kinds of sounds we want to hear. So let's take a look at the free synthesizer Helm, which you can download now and get started with. Helm is excellent to grasp what's going on due to its awesome animations and its easy to use interface, not to mention it sounds great. The first step is to identify the oscillators. Here we have the aptly named oscillator section with 2 custom oscillators, 1 dedicated sub-bass oscillator, and 1 noise generating oscillator. The mixer section determines the volume of each one and how they are mixed together. So each oscillator will generate a waveform, and you'll notice the name of the waveforms correspond to its shape. So the most common and simplest waveform is the sine wave. It's what we call a pure tone wave, which possesses a fundamental frequency with no harmonics. Now, don't concern yourself with the technicalities right now, as it's something to be covered later on when focusing on the waveforms more in depth. But a pure, unaltered sine wave is the most commonly used to produce something like deep bass and deep sub-bass sounds, as it behaves really well at low frequencies. Triangle waves are similar to sine waves, but produce some harmonics. This causes them to sound somewhat higher, richer, and a bit louder and fuller than a sine wave played at the same frequency. So we can also use a triangle wave for a bit more pronounced, almost heavier sounding bass. The sawtooth wave, also known as a riser wave, rises and then falls steeply. Now, violins produce a sawtooth-like sound, which can even be visualized in slow motion as the bow grips the string, pulls and releases thousands of times a second. The square wave is extremely dramatic in nature and results in harsher, louder sounds. And the harsh sounds come from the intense nature of the waveform, which effectively switches on and off really, really quickly, very unlike the smooth nature of the sine wave. Finally, we have noise. Now, there are different types of noise, but we'll cover the most common type, white noise. And white noise has many different applications, but one of the more popular ones and use of it is to create rising and falling sweeps. The reason for this is that it carries a lot of energy. Now, in terms of its waveform, it's actually randomly generated and designed to fill the entire frequency spectrum. White noise is also tone agnostic, meaning you can play any note and it will sound the same as the full frequency spectrum is still filled. So that's the source of our sound. The next is modulation. Now, because we use modulators to do things to our sound, when setting them up, we always need to remember three things. We have a modulator, which is our source. We have a destination, which is what we're wanting to modulate. And then lastly, we have the amount of modulation, how much we want this modulator to affect the thing we're modulating. It might sound confusing now, but it will be crystal clear by the end of this course, and you'll be a pro at setting them up. So in our signal chain, the first step of modulation, which actually doesn't require any setup, and we don't even really think about it in music as modulation, it lies in changing how fast the signal oscillates. And the faster the signal oscillates, the higher the pitch. And this is done simply by playing different notes, raising and lowering the frequency at which the signal oscillates. So by playing notes, we're actually changing the modulation speed of our waveform. So here you can see with the sine wave, the higher the notes, it just means the higher the frequency of oscillations, in other words, pitch. Now, it's great that we can start producing sounds using various waveforms and then change the oscillation frequency or pitch. But if everyone just used generic sounds, music would get very boring very quickly. Fortunately, there are plenty of ways we can manipulate the sounds we create. So the next type of modulation we're going to discuss is changing various parameters within our synthesizer over time using ADSR envelopes, common to most synthesizers. Envelope behavior is determined by MIDI note instructions, notably note on and note off events when a key is pressed and then released. So the entire function of the envelope is performed from when the synthesizer receives a MIDI note on instruction and will execute its final procedure when it receives a MIDI note off instruction. ADSR envelopes comprise of several different stages, notably attack time, decay time, sustain level, and release time. As mentioned earlier, ADSR envelopes modulate different parameters within the synthesizer. Now, the most common being amplitude or volume, filter cutoff frequencies, and resonance levels. For now, and for the sake of this demonstration, we'll just focus on amplitude or volume envelopes. And most synthesizers already have envelopes hardwired to the destinations, so they don't actually require any assignment setup. So the whole process is started the moment a key is pressed or a MIDI note is played. First, we have a period of attack. So the attack time in synthesis is different to the attack parameters you'll later come across when dealing with effects and describing sounds. So if we talk about a drum and say there's more attack, it's sharper and almost louder at the beginning. But in a synthesizer, increasing the attack time actually softens the beginning of the note. Attack time determines the length of time it takes for the volume of the note to move from a level of 0 as the key is pressed to its maximum volume. Following this logic, if we have an attack time of 0, the note will immediately play at its maximum. Notice how as soon as the key is pressed, we hear a sound. If we have a really long attack time, you will hear the note rising in volume from 0 until it hits its maximum. Shorter attack times mean faster rise to its maximum volume, whereas a longer attack time means a longer rise. So what are some of the real-life practical applications of being able to control attack time? So you can use attack time in a variety of different situations. For example, you'll get a small unwanted click at the beginning of a note. Using a very quick attack time will help just cut out that click. Short attack times can also be used to soften instruments, so it sounds like less of a hard note press, and longer attack times can be used for fading in or swelling ambient sounds. So once the attack phase is completed, the decay stage begins. This is the time it takes for the volume to fall to its main volume level, the sustain level. So if no decay is set, then the volume will immediately drop to the sustain level. Practically, the purpose of using a combination of attack and decay is to cause an initial spike in volume when our sound initially plays. It helps give our sound more impact when it starts, similar to how a violin player can initially pull hard on a note when starting the note, and then comfortably and smoothly play the rest of the note at a lower volume. Let's set a modest attack time and decay time, and as soon as the key is pressed, the volume will rise to the allotted attack time and then begin decaying over the decay time. Now, unlike the other ADSR parameters, the sustain parameter does not have anything to do with time, but it's rather a level, setting what we consider to be the main volume of the note. The actual time the sustain level plays for is entirely determined by how long the note or key press is held for. Once the key is released, the sustain period is over and then the release phase begins. A low sustain level means our sound will be low in volume, whilst a high sustain level means a higher volume for our sound. The final stage of the ADSR envelope is the release stage. This is triggered when the MIDI note has ended or the key has been released. So even if the envelope is still executing in the earlier phases, if the key is released, the envelope will immediately jump to its release stage. Setting the release parameter will give us a fade out effect, dropping the volume from its sustained level to 0. We can think of this when plucking a guitar string or striking a piano key. Even though the note has finished being played, it will still sound for a period of time, fading out over the release phase. A short release time means it fades out quickly, whilst a long release time will have the sound fade out slowly. So that's the volume envelope. Helm's implementation sees the volume envelope shape the volume of the entire synthesizer, but it's important to note that some synthesizers, like Ableton's Operator for example, have a volume envelope hardwired to each oscillator. Others provide the means to assign envelopes to different parameters, so just bear that in mind. Right, so let's play around with some of the concepts we've learned. Here I have a basic build-up into where I want a holding period before the drop. So what I'm feeling is to have a somewhat aggressive, hard-hitting bass that swells around the kick, giving a heavy pumping feeling. So let's load in Helm. We'll keep the sawdown waveform as it gives a nice raspy, gritty texture. So turn oscillator 1 all the way up. Next, let's add a bit of sub into the mix and choose whatever tickles your fancy, but I quite like the square waveform, so I'm going to mix it in about 60% of the way. Right, so now that we have a basic sound, we want to sculpt its swelling movement by introducing some attack on the volume envelope. Just under 500 milliseconds sounds about right. And that's it for the synthesizer, but let's just finish it off by adding a stock standard chorus effect to give it some width. All that's left to do is program in some notes, and because we want it to swell around the kick, in this case, the note should start with the kick. Job done. So you can see how relatively easy it is to get really creative with just a volume envelope. I now want you to start playing around with different waveforms and envelope configurations and just see what kind of interesting sounds you can come up with. So in the next segment of this course, we're going to take a look at filters and how we can begin modulating them to give us a classic deadmau5 kind of sound. And I'm really excited about this one because we're using such a simple technique and it has some really impressive results. As always, I hope you guys found this incredibly helpful and super interesting. Guys, have an awesome day and catch you in the next one.